And therefore, your first biggest primary fiduciary duty is the truth itself, here. To be loyal to the truth itself, even if it's, going to make something look bad or you're going to lose out on money or something like that. That is the primary thing that you should be focused on. But then the other part of it is going back to the idea of the role of science in society. You're charged in a lot of ways, and particularly even more so now as we're doing more on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all the rest, with not just the social sciences, but a lot of the physical scientists are there now. You're getting to the point of doing a lot more societal education. Hello. I was going to talk about something else, but this then caught my attention and got me thinking, actually, about things that I've talked about, because I very much share the notion that you can only have one telos, which means you can only have one ultimate purpose. And the ultimate purpose of scientists, I think, is the pursuit of the truth. But I was inspired when I said that after reading some of the commentary of Jonathan Haidt, who, if you don't know, is the author of The Righteous Mind and co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, and also is one of the founders of Heterodox Academy, which is why I'm here on this page, because the original piece that he wrote about you can't have two teloses, you can't have two ultimate purposes, you can only have one, because ultimately if you try to have two, they're going to come into conflict with each other at some point, and you're going to have to pick one. And he talks about the two fiduciary duties of professors. And it got me thinking, because a lot of times, many scientists who are also scholars, thought leaders at universities, many times professors. And so thinking about how much this overlaps, and is there anything else or anything different that I would think of or that others would think of here. He also goes into mandatory anti-racism statements and causing professors to violate their fiduciary duties, which is down here also, and we'll touch at that briefly. But again, this is a fascinating piece. I would be curious, for those of you who go read it, what you think of it. It certainly got me thinking. So let's see. Two fiduciary duties of professors. Why the concept of fiduciary duty is useful in the academy, and how mandatory anti-racism statements cause professors to violate their fiduciary duties. In September 2016, I gave a lecture at Duke University, quote, "Two Incompatible Sacred Values in American Universities." I suggested that the ancient Greek word telos was helpful for understanding the rapid cultural change going on in America's top universities that began in the fall of 2015. I would actually say that it's been going on a fair bit sooner than that, because of some of the things that got introduced into the universities to push that cultural shift in the 70s. So that's a whole other thing, but I don't necessarily agree with the timeline. I do agree with some of the other things going on, but that's a whole other thing, neither here nor there. Telos means, quote, "the end, goal, or purpose for which an act is done, or at which a profession or institution aims. The telos of a knife is to cut. The telos of medicine is to heal. The telos of a university is truth," I suggested. The word, or close cognates, appears on the word truth, I think is what he means, not the word telos, appears on many university crests or practices and norms, some stretching back to Plato's Academy. Only makes sense if you see a university as an institution organized to help scholars get closer to truth using particular methods in their field. I said that universities can have many goals, such as fiscal health and successful sports teams, and many values, such as social justice, national service, or Christian humility. But they can only have one telos, because telos is like a North Star. It is the end, purpose, or goal around which an institution is structured. An institution can rotate on one axis only. If it tries to elevate a second goal or value to the status of telos, it is like trying to get a spinning top or rotating solar system to simultaneously rotate around two axes. Hold on. Momentary break with the cat talking to me. Pardon. I argued that the sudden wave of protests and changes that were sweeping through universities were attempts to elevate the value of social justice to become a second telos, which would require a massive restructuring of universities and their norms in a way that damaged their ability to find truth. Indeed, and I agree with this because unfortunately, with social justice being such a charged and somewhat political thing, that doesn't lend itself well to being interested in the truth. And in a lot of ways, some of the postmodernist literature argues that objective truth doesn't even exist and perhaps isn't even desirable at all if it did exist. In some cases, arguing that truth is constructed by whomever's in power, which is fascinating in and of itself to think of, that objective truth doesn't exist, and hence all this, some of the social constructionist stuff. But yeah, that doesn't lend itself well. That belief that objective truth doesn't exist doesn't lend itself well to a university or an institution or a profession that regards the pursuit of the truth as its telos, or at least initially does. Expanded the argument in a blog post for Heterodox Academy, where I predicted that the conflict between truth and social justice is likely to become unmanageable. Universities that try to honor both will face increasing incoherence and internal conflict. It's now 6 years later, and I think it's clear that this prediction has come true. It has been 6 years of near constant conflict, with rising numbers of attempts to get scholars fired or punished for things they have said, and a never-ending stream of videos showing students and sometimes professors saying and doing things that are gifts to critics of the universities and of the left. As one university president said to a friend of mine in 2019, universities are becoming ungovernable. Public trust in universities has plummeted since 2015, first on the right and later across the board. We are in trouble. Yes. This is a correct statement. It's an observation I've seen too with some of the things here with polling and what have you, is that universities, the trust in universities writ large has gone down, or has at times been mixed in some polling, because I think I've seen some polling where it's kind of a mixed bag. Where it's different and interesting is that in a lot of the polling, and even in the last couple of years, a lot of the polling, the trust in scientists, many of whom are housed at universities, and the trust in in doctors generally, and scientists and engineers, has remained fairly high. Actually, I don't have the number right in front of me of exactly what it was, but varying things from Pew to Gallup to other things have shown that there's still a decent amount of trust amongst the public of those professions. And so that's an interesting thing, because I've always wondered at the interplay, you know, do you lose trust if you're at a university, or do people separate you, the scientist who works at a university, from the university who might have a horrible administration, or some other things? This is a totally different problem. How do we get out of this mess? How do we regain the respect of the public? There's no easy answer, because many of our problems are tied to the broader problems of the country, particularly its ever-intensifying political polarization spiral and the increasing levels of anxiety and fragility of our incoming students. So let's see. So what he gets into here, and I don't necessarily disagree that the political polarization spiral is a problem, though I wonder if it came out of the university and then got into the public and has since made things worse when we get new students who are already really quasi-polarized coming in and have those levels of anxiety and fragility. But there's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of a question, if you will, that comes to my mind. In the rest of this essay, I'd like to introduce the concept of fiduciary duty, which I believe complements the concept of telos, and can explain the moral incoherence that has overtaken the Academy since 2015, as well as give us a moral foundation upon which to stand when we resist pressures to violate our duties. And I want to say this also for scientists, in light of things like the Ethics and Society Review Boards, in light which was put forward in a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences article, and the thing like the Nature Human Behavior editorial, and all this kind of stuff, when we're being asked, what have you. And if you think also specifically of that wild paper that we did on the Rogue Journal Club, the Words Matter, on the last Rogue Journal Club episode, when we talked about that, where you're openly calling for censorship of people and saying it's okay, it's a recalibration of norms and a evolution, if you will, and it's not cancel culture, it's consequences culture was the attempted rebranding in the article. Oh my gosh. But the idea of having fiduciary duties is a little bit different because obviously it's not a fiscal thing that you're talking about. It's a little bit different. The word fiduciary comes to us from the Latin fidere, to trust. In any large-scale society, people need to rely on others who are not kin, often when they are in position of vulnerability. Roman English and later American law all developed legal designations that enable some people or institutions to hire themselves out as trustees who act as agents of the person, the principal, who invest trust in them. Such agents have fiduciary duties toward their beneficiaries, which means first and foremost absolute loyalty. They must put the needs of the beneficiary first and must never, ever profit at the beneficiary's expense. They must avoid and eliminate all conflicts of interest because the lure of such potential benefits can, and often does, corrupt and subvert the fiduciary's ability to carry out their duty. American corporate law has interpreted fiduciary duties using the psychology of purity and sanctity. A fiduciary relationship is treated as something different, higher, purer than a simple contractual relationship. As explained by Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Cardozo in 1928, quote, "A trustee is held to something stricter than the morals of the marketplace, not honesty alone, but the punctilio of honor the most sensitive is then the standard of behavior. As to this, there has developed a tradition that is unbending and inveterate. Only thus has the level of conduct for fiduciaries been kept at a level higher than that trodden by the crowd." Is the concept of fiduciary duty useful in the academy? To what must professors show such absolute loyalty, such elevated ethics, with no deviations or compromises? This is where we come back to the idea of the purpose. I have said many times that I always think that one of the primary purposes of science is the pursuit of the truth. Not truth itself per se, but the pursuit of it. Because you're in a process where you're asking and answering questions on a really regular basis when you're talking about research studies in physical sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, engineering, and medicine, for that matter, is you're after the pursuit of the truth. A lot of the times. So that is why I often believe it's a telos, is because of the structure of the process that's involved is geared toward that. But it also requires that somebody who's doing that have that zealful dedication and elevated and absolute loyalty to pursuing that to an intense degree. And this is kind of why I think it's actually quite parallel with not just professors per se, but with scientists, any professor who's a scientist, any professor who's in the science disciplines, natural, physical, medicine, engineering, etc., along with the social sciences. It's not just the professors, but also anybody who's a scientist who's outside of that, in the government, in government agencies, for instance, in NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in nonprofits, in businesses even. There's an obligation there. And Jonathan goes through two such duties, which I think are actually really relevant. I believe that we have two such duties related to our two distinct roles as teachers and as scholars. As teachers, I believe we have a fiduciary duty to our students' education. As scholars, I believe we have a fiduciary duty to the truth. Let me note right away that the concept doesn't fit perfectly. Our students are not our principals. We are not their agents. We are not obligated to act in their best interest overall. We are duty-bound to advance their education and never to act in a way that retards it. When we do our jobs well, we are professional educators, not therapists, coaches, or patients. Similarly, for the truth, it is not a person or principal who has hired us as agent and can give us orders. So I'm going to call these relationships fiduciary duties. In this case, I think if I were to say who the principal is, the principal, in a weird way, is the objective truth. And being after that, regardless, that is the loyalty there, regardless of what narratives are flung at you. And this creates an interesting tension because you run into such challenges as doesn't fit the narrative or challenges the narrative, or as I mentioned earlier this week, you could have the unknown unknowns, where somebody just takes your research as truthful as it is and twists it and spins it, and the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. You know, um, and so that is a tricky challenge. So I can understand the concern there. But I do agree, it's not a perfect fiduciary duty because you're not necessarily bound to a person. You're bound to an idea, and to a particular duty for that idea. The elements of elevated ethics, near sacredness, and a ban on conflicts of interest work quite well, as you can see from some hypothetical examples of professors with such conflicts. The mere contemplation of such situations should give us all a feeling of discomfort or disgust. What do you think about these four professors? Professor A assigns his own textbook to his psychology class, even though the book is 20 years out of date, because he wants to maximize his royalty payments. That's a guy who's not putting the education of the students above his own benefit. Professor B plans her psychology lecture on love and sexuality in a way that she knows will make her appealing to young men, because she likes to date those men after they graduated from college and become fair targets. Professor C is an evangelical Christian teaching English literature at a secular university who chooses readings and uses his lectures to encourage students who are lapsed Christians to renew their faith in Jesus Christ. Professor D is a right-wing activist teaching English literature at a state school in a red state. She chooses readings and uses her lectures to encourage students to support her favorite right-wing causes and candidates. You could flip that to be left-wing too, and it would be just as bad. But all of these are horrible ideas. And I do think with scientists just generally, there is not the same fiduciary duty to the education of the students, but there is the same kind of fiduciary duty, I think. And Jonathan, if you end up watching this, I'd be curious to hear what you think. There's not the same fiduciary duty to students per se, or to the education of students per se. But perhaps there is the same fiduciary duty to educating the public now about your own research, or communicating it carefully, or some such similar kind of thing. I do wonder if that's the case as a fiduciary duty, because, as I said, I'm not just thinking about this in the context of just the university professors who are also scientists. I'm thinking about this in the context of university scientists more broadly. So that includes everybody who's not in a university. At the same time, what are their fiduciary duties in the same kind of vein? Because I do think it's actually a very useful concept to be thinking about. What are the things that you have to be elevating? And let's say, for example, as something that might be unethical in the fiduciary duty of a scientist, let us say that a particular university scientist gives a horrid review. Not a university scientist, particular scientist gives a horrid peer review, because they know they're about to publish something, or they're about to get published something that is the same topic, and they really want to be the first ones to talk about it because that's greater credibility for them. That's boosting reputation and credibility. You were innovative kind of thing, but doing it at the expense of somebody else who perhaps has it out there sooner and has it out there better than you. And you just don't want them to do that because, you want the benefit for yourself. That would be a similar style violation of fiduciary duty, in terms of you have to have no conflict of interest when you're communicating to the public. And admittedly, that's peer review of a journal, but you can imagine something similar, that let's say it's a preprint that gets talked about, that it hasn't quite gone through peer review yet, or it is an article that has gone through peer review, And you end up slandering it, not because of any legitimate criticisms of the methods of how the article was done or anything like that, but it's it basically you wanted to be first and you weren't. And so you're slandering it. That would be one kind of such thing that I would think of as an example of violating a fiduciary duty that a scientist would have. In borrowing Jonathan's analogy here, the fiduciary duty that they would have in making sure not just any students would be well educated on something, but also that the public, policymakers, society writ large would be well educated on something. And the reason I like to phrase it this way is I've said it more than a few times, because there is such high trust in scientists generally, if not in universities. Because there is such high trust in scientists generally and not necessarily in universities. That level of trust, where you have the studies show and people rely on those studies for making decisions in society or making decisions in local communities or even making decisions in their own lives, we have to recognize that that is a tremendous amount of power, and it's quite a temptation to not be providing the truth itself or educating on what is going on in the science to society if it means you could manipulate or get something you more want in terms of your own societal interest. So in other words, the fiduciary duty there is not just students' education, it is being the educator of society with respect to your scientific discipline and talking truthfully about this is what the science says, and not just your own work, not just promoting your own work, but anything, even such things that might end up being completely to the opposite of what you would believe. And trying to do that and being honest about doing that. And that doesn't necessarily mean, perfect education or something like this. With that, because that's not what we're talking about. When you're talking about research as opposed to teaching students, you're talking about sharing, this is what the research is, this is what it says, and this is some of the critiques that I have of it, which is different than necessarily the education background, where you're teaching students some of the basics and fundamental basics so they can go on and do some kinds of this research if that is their chosen career path. So that's a different kind of thing, but I think it's a very similar kind of fiduciary duty that scientists have, it's just not limited to education of students. It is broadly more inclusive of the idea of talking with society and advising society, when that is quite a potent role that scientists do have in society, is advising particularly on societal decision making at policy level, be it local, state, federal, etc. So that's the kind of thing I wanted to hit at with that. Do you agree that all four of these professors behaved unprofessionally? All four are treating their students as a means to advance their own ends: financial, sexual, religious, and political. I made Professor D a right wing, but I assume you'll agree the violation is just as bad for a left wing activist in a blue state. All four have therefore violated their quasi-fiduciary duty of loyalty, which requires them to advance their students' education, not their own projects. Yes. So in the vein of what I was just talking about is just the broader fiduciary duty at the similar scale than scientists. Scientists have the quasi-fiduciary duty of loyalty, requiring them to provide the truth itself. It's not I guess the best way I can say it is it's not necessarily enough to research the truth. It's got to be about good communication of the truth, about advising even if it sucks and what have you. And maybe I'm conflating two things together, but I think of it more broadly, and it's an education of society, not just an education of students. Let's put it that way. As you can tell, I'm thinking about this on the fly. So it might not be so fully flushed out. I'm thinking about this a little bit on the fly, but I hope you would get a little bit of some of the idea of what I'm trying to say. We can do the same thought experiment for professors as scholars and scientists who violate their quasi-fiduciary duty to the truth. Professor A works hard to prove that social media is not harmful to adolescents because a social media platform pays her $100,000 for each study she publishes that support that conclusion. Professor B decides to spin his research findings away from what he knows is true in order to avoid taking a controversial stance because he knows such a stance would reduce his ability to find a sexual partner. Professor C is a biblical scholar who distorts her translation of an ancient manuscript because she believes that an accurate translation would cause some people to lose faith in God. Professor D is a left-wing political scientist who deletes all qualitative interviews he conducted for his book that he thinks might make progressives look bad. What did you think of these four professors? Did they behave professionally, or did they violate their quasi-fiduciary duty to the truth? I think they all distorted their scholarship and put work into the public that is not honest, not faithful to the truth, because they were pursuing their own agendas for money, sex, religion, and politics. Once again, I'll assume you agree that Professor D is equally culpable whether he's on the left or right. All four would bring disgrace to the Academy if their actions became known. This is where I actually think it's quite similar, because I think the communication part of it is very different from the actual research part of it. I keep the two of them separately. The communication education of society versus the fiduciary thing of actually writing truthfully and doing analysis truthfully. A similar kind of thing for a scientist with this one is just generally speaking biasing research to make X group look bad, to make Y group look bad, and things along that line. Or similar kinds of thing in physical sciences you could do. And you would hope that peer review would catch these things. It's not always the case, but you would hope that it would. But this is actually where I think it is quite similar, regardless of if you're talking about university professor or scientist that is not a university position. That you do have such obligation to the truth that you must avoid such conflicts of interest, or you must publish something that may not be that will likely not be to your benefit. It is if it is the truth and found to be the truth, and particularly if it goes through peer review and you did great with your methods and what have you, such that you can get by peer review and get it published. That's the other aspect of this, right? So it's fascinating to me. That's why I wanted to bring this particular thing up, because I do think that there's professors because not all scientists are professors. That's why I wanted to think about this idea in the context of, I do think that scientists writ large have their ultimate telos as being the pursuit of the truth, regardless of what reason they got into science. So, like, you talked about some scientists who was well, for me, for instance, I went running around in thunderstorms as a kid, so hence the reason I went into meteorology and climate. I just had a love of that. Love and a curiosity of it that drove me to go after some of the serious research things that are done now. But that is an interesting thing to me, because I do think there are the two of them. Like I said, the first one I think is broader. It's not just students' education, it's societal education. That goes back to proper communication and how you phrase it and how you frame it and trying not to manipulate people. I actually do have lots of problems with communication specialists who attempt to manipulate people in the framing of articles such that the results in the analysis are good, but you're framing it in such a way to make certain groups look bad in the communication aspect. Not in the manipulation of the analysis itself, in the communication aspect. Two different things. Jonathan goes on here to discuss here actually that he's about to he's announced in this article that he's looking to leave eventually. Well, not looking to leave, but he's got a problem with the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, because they are asking him as part of the annual conference to submit a statement on whether or how the submission advances equity, inclusion, and anti-racism goals of the SPSP. And he's talked about it here. I've talked about it here, so I'm not going to, pile on with that. But the mandatory DEI statements are revolting, to be truthful, because you are demanding people have a explicit ideology and what have you, and completely ignoring diversity of thought and all of that. The SPSP mandate, however, forced us all to do something more explicitly ideological. Note that the word diversity was dropped and replaced by anti-racism. So every psychologist who wants to present at the most important convention in our field must now say how their work advances anti-racism. I have read Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, in the summer of 2020, so I knew that I could no longer stay silent. He goes on to talk here about how he wrote to the president of the SPSP, talked about how much it was problematic in here, and got an answer back. She said that part of the mission of the SPSP should involve amplifying the voices of those that have historically been underrepresented in the field. Something that Jonathan agrees with in here. But like all values, I think it must not be raised to a second telos. She also affirmed that yes, mandatory statements are now official policy, and she added, I am not super clear on why anti-racism is viewed as problematic. The kind of anti-racism that the kind of anti-racism that Ibram X. Kendi puts is bad, because as you can see, this is actually straight out of the book. Ibram X. Kendi's book. The only remedy for racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That doesn't seem to end well, that you put a never-ending thing of discrimination in there. But that is a whole other thing. So what he goes on to say, and I'm not going to belittle this because I don't want this to run too long. I'm sorry, not belittle this. I'm not going to belabor this, let's put it this way, because I encourage you to go read this because it's fascinating in itself. And I was more concerned with the first part because I think it's a fascinating idea of a concept to start thinking of it, not just for professors, but for scientists. What is your fiduciary duty? Or fiduciary duties, as it will. This part was really interesting to me because I do think in the idea that the primary telos of scientists is the pursuit of the truth. And therefore, your first biggest primary fiduciary duty is the truth itself, here. To be loyal to the truth itself, even if it's, going to make something look bad or you're going to lose out on money or something like that. That is the primary thing that you should be focused on. But then the other part of it is going back to the idea of the role of science in society. You're charged in a lot of ways, and particularly even more so now as we're doing more on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all the rest, with not just the social sciences, but a lot of the physical scientists are there now. You're getting to the point of doing a lot more societal education, and being out there as a scientist doing that. And a lot of early career scientists, at least that I have seen, are getting involved in science communication as well, to understand how to talk, and not just in the technical aspects of articles or presentations or what have you, but how to present your work to the public. How do you present your work, your policymaker, and anything like that. So you do have a quasi-fiduciary duty to societal education. Though you got to realize that sometimes best laid plans go awry. And you can put it out there, you can be the nicest, the cleanest thing and what have you, and somebody else will pick it up and distort it. That's not necessarily your fault, though. Then the question would be going further in the fiduciary duty track, is it your responsibility then to correct the person who completely misrepresented your work? Which I might actually argue it is partly your responsibility to go out there and correct somebody for doing that. But it's certainly fascinating. Jonathan Haidt, I think this was a brilliant piece to me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for writing it. And it got me thinking with respect to my own field, and respect to just scientists more broadly. As you can tell, this was kind of unfiltered. Goes with the channel. I usually am reading things and thinking through it as I'm reading it. So things there. What do you guys think with that? And if you're watching, listening, leave a comment below and let me know what you think on that. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you like the video. Comment the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all of it lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.